Well, hello everyone. This is Ron Burgess with Micro Giants again. Glad to have those of you join us. And today we have Ed Lasak, who is a CPA, MA, and a highly experienced COO. And we've got John Mills, a kind of a classic entrepreneur who has been in the electronics business. Had his own company and is now in the real estate business with some offices, and does both of these gentlemen do consulting outside. I mean, do consulting and have lots and lots of experience with other companies than the ones that they're in or have started themselves. So today we've got a pretty an interesting subject to me. We're going to continue with analysis of what to do when you actually have the data. So, and we've got Edgar Martin, who just joined us. He's a mighty micro giant. He's got a lot of banking experience. He's gotten into business in the specialty restaurant business, and so thanks for joining us, Edgar.
Sorry I'm late. I was at a customer's location and we just freed up our conversation.
So that's the entrepreneur's life right there, dealing with customers, and that's all good. That's all good.
Yes.
So so we'll go ahead and we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen right now, and here we go. So this is sort of this is continued on just a little bit longer than I thought in terms of the analysis part. So we've got the data, and we're trying to do the full analysis. And the more I do, the more I realize we haven't finished the analysis and assessment side of it. And so this one really has to do with some tools to spot trends. What we're going to talk about is something a little bit of a cul-de-sac, but it's really important, and it's come to be understood by me better and better over the last several years. I've used the old 80-20 rule for many years, decades, as it has to do with customers. And the old idea that is that 20% of your customers produce about 80% of your revenue. Now that's not 100% true, but what it does is that because that's sort of weighted, this law is weighted that way. If you don't have an 80-20 mix, then something else might be amiss with your business, or another characteristic or consideration should be looked at. So we're going to be focusing today kind of around this whole issue. It's also called the law of the vital few, or the principle of factor sparsity. And then there's another one called Price's law, which is almost the same thing, but and this is a mathematical represented, where the square root of the number of employees ends up being producing 50% of the outcome. So in this particular example, for instance, if you had 100 employees, 10% or 10 employees will do half the work. And so that's the square root of 100. And you go, wow, I mean, is that really possible? Do half of, or do 90% of our employees only do the other half? And the answer is, more often than not, it's going to be fairly close to that particular principle. That's pretty shocking. That's a shocking thing, just in and of itself. And so, wanted to mention very briefly that we're used to an average distribution. We would call it a normal distribution. Actually, that's what this bell curve here is. And you're probably all I know you guys are familiar with, but and many others out there watching today will be familiar with it's the standard deviation, meaning you go out one standard deviation, and that's about 34%, and you go the other way, that's 34%. So most of the people in the particular sample, or most of the incidents of the measurement, say number of parts or whatever you're measuring, will end up right here in the middle. And then, another percentage will be out here, and then way out on the tail will only be about 4%. 2% on each side. So that's, and there's a lot more we could talk about that, and I'm not really qualified as a statistician, to really tell you much about that. But in contrast, this is a Pareto distribution. And some people would draw it, and I don't know what this little hook here is in this illustration, but many people would draw this coming down like this and then going all the way to zero. Mathematically, if you Jordan Peterson had an example of this. Mathematically, if you flip a coin, flip a coin, flip a coin, we all would assume that, well, 50% of the time you win and 50% of the time you lose. But what tends to happen is if you say you have a total of five coins to flip and you lose one coin, once you lose that coin, there are fewer and fewer and fewer flipping. And so what happens is that literally all of the money, if you flip enough, all of the money goes from a completely even distribution to one person has 100% of the coins. Very interesting to watch the curve as you have more and more and more and more flips. And I've got that video if any of you are interested. So what does this kind of natural phenomena really kind of mean to various groupings? And there are just tons of circumstances. We've talked about revenue streams, has to do with product popularity, intelligence. And of course, we have to put this in perspective. Intelligence is a normal distribution, but the productivity of the high end of intelligence ends up being the 80-20. Worker productivity, we talked about that. Leadership, a small number of leaders are the ones who create, say, most of the value in a company. Wealth distributions, a lot of people are concerned about wealth. Marx certainly was concerned that too few people had too much wealth, but it's a natural mathematical phenomenon that we don't want to get off into politics, but you have to do extraordinary things to keep the hardest working, brightest, luckiest, most fortunate people from naturally accumulating the wealth. So that's a social problem. Some would suggest, and the only way that you can do anything to that is something that's unnatural, because it's a natural mathematical thing. Same thing with priorities and tasks. Same thing with music downloads. So, other examples, 80% of sales are made by 20% of the customers. 80% of the complaints registered by a company are usually made by 20% of the customers. In computer science, Microsoft noticed that by focusing on 20% of the bugs, that they could end up solving 80% of the system crashes. In health and safety, 20% of the risks can lead to 80% of the accidents. And here we're back to music again. 1% of all the artists get 50% of all downloads. So, and if you push that out just a little bit more over time, 1/10 of 1%, who are usually the people like Bach and Beethoven, end up having 60 or 80% of the 50% that is downloaded. So you have a truly minuscule number of people who are getting the largest percentage of play or money or widgets or whatever it is that you're counting. So with that in mind, I just wanted to say that, we have an extensive review of how to do this in a very early Microgiants meeting. But the way you look at your customers, because a lot of you will want to do this evaluation, is what you do is you take each customer and you put the revenue in and you accumulate it. And so in a spreadsheet, you just add one to the other, and you get down to a point where you go, okay, this is about 10%. and then that's about 80% of the revenue. So it's easy to do with a cumulative sum as you go down through all of your customers. And I just want to mention that's possible, but just a practical thing that I'm going to leave you with, but we're going to get back into some more theoretical stuff here. So when you take a look, how do you use this? When you take a look at market share, many times, and this has been noticed by several other marketing research people over the years, many times the first the largest in a particular market will have from 30 to 50% of all of the business. Now, that's not going to be true where you have many players, and every industry doesn't act exactly the same. But you could look at phone companies, for instance, and you'd see it falling into line, and just many other ones. The second one, many times, has half of the revenue of the top one. The third one has half again of the third one. Therefore, the top three take the majority of the business in most markets, and I've noticed this to be true as well. And then all the rest will split just 20 or from 20 to 40% of the market. And each one of you know that the PIMS principles really illustrates how dramatic this can be on your margin, and so that's the tie-in right there, is that you want to be in the first, second, or third, where you don't have a chance of being able to maintain margins. So it also illustrates a lot of other natural phenomena. About 15% of all the players last year produced 85% of all the total wins. This is, boy, if you're not in that 15%, you're going to be a losing team right there. And I mentioned the hazards here. If 100 papers are written by 25 authors, 5 will have contributed 50 papers. And again, that's Price's law specifically. So the productivity really happens among high achieving people, high achieving customers, or large purchasing customers, sort of the sort of top tier. A lot of us will look at that and go, oh, that's kind of crazy, but it's the truth. And of course, the big one I mentioned is well, what about income distribution? Well, the richest 20% have 82% of the income, and on it goes. So what do you do if your revenue is broken by, or is ruled by the Pareto differences, or is not exactly 80-20. And so this is just something that I put together to illustrate, if you're not in this normal, which is this tier down here, then what does it mean? And so if you happen to have, say, 5% of your customers generating 95% of your revenue, that would indicate that you really have an extreme risk, because you got big gorillas and they can hold you hostage. So your prices tend to be a little bit lower, because you really, you got to deal with these 5 big gorillas in your business. If you happen to be 90-10, you still, you might want to consider really working on getting 3 or 4 more of the same size, so that you don't have this margin pressure. It's not as bad as the 90-5-5, but 90-10 is still kind of risky a little bit. If you're down lower, this is kind of a safer place to be in terms of revenue, because if you 30% are producing 70% of your business, then you've got a safer margin for people leaving you as a customer. But on the other hand, it's a possibility that your salespeople are not stretching hard enough to go get the larger volume customers. So it's not conclusive, it's not a rule, but it really gives you an opportunity to think through what you need to understand. Here you have a similar kind of ratio, just so you can see it visually. And here's kind of what happens to profitability based on where your percentages are. And I've used these to try to help balance. It's not easy to do, but knowing about it's better than not knowing about it. Here's another final example that is kind of focused on a totally different area, and this is to illustrate that this principle goes through all of our data. Now, this is simply a map of customers. All the dots are customers of a particular company that happens to be based. This illustration is in Riverside, California, and in this particular case, 5 miles, you can see how incredibly dense their customers are right here. Whoops, excuse me. How incredibly dense. And then you go out one more, another 10 miles, and you can see how the density goes down dramatically. And then you go out 25 miles and it goes down dramatically again. And so when you look at this, you can go, well, gee, about 70–80% of our customers are really close in. And so what are we doing outside of this area? And in this particular case, there was a salesman that was all the way up in here. That happens to be Lake Arrowhead. And he spent a lot of time selling up here. Well, without that salesperson, this whole density area would go away. And so the question is, he lived there, okay, we're going to let him sell there. But they were sending salespeople way out into here because they had one behemoth customer out in Pomona. And when they looked at their numbers, it made it look like there was a market. There's no market out here. I mean, take a look at it. Well, why would you drive into the traffic to spend a lot of time trying to get more business when you're really not very effective? So that's kind of the overall thought. And so I thought I'd open it up here a little bit and talk about some of the problems that we have with production, with revenue, etc., and just get some ideas on how you've noticed the Pareto Principle actually being used, how you've or how you might use it, etc. So who wants to be first?
Well, I'll start off with one. I've actually got two, but I'll save the other one for a little later. I'm thinking about a situation where you have positioned a business to be mid-market. So you've got some businesses that are very high end above you, and you've got some businesses that are very low end below you, and you've positioned yourself in the mid-market. Now, when you do analysis of your customers, you come out and hypothetically actually in real case, in this case, you end up with a 30-70 rule, maybe even a 40-60 rule. Mm-hmm. And you go, okay, is this indicative? I understand that it's safe in the sense that the offering that you have can be replaced if one of your clients leaves, because it's a pretty tight margin area and people are attracted to it. But I'm wondering if that also means that there's room for growth at the higher end, even though you're kind of got a mid-market approach. What can I do to increase the value for somebody who really wants to be differentiated and have more services or a better whatever it happens to be, and they're prepared to pay 30% more? So we get a little bit more to the 20-80 or the 30-70.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure that it applies, but I'm not sure that it applies exactly in that way, because what you're kind of doing is saying, I have a market that might actually look pretty safe. And so in order to change that, you're not talking about just adding more business, but if you're actually trying to change that and say, develop more higher end companies, which I think that would be an indication. It's like, maybe we're not going after these bigger companies.
Right. Maybe our offering is we need to go and vamp it up a little bit so that we can charge more.
And so it may indicate that, we need to do exactly that. And it would be an indication, but I'm not sure that there's a direct implication. I have to think about this because they're in mid-market. I'm not sure that means you could go up market, and because you're really, it applies to each niche.
It does.
It's like
so there is a bit of a niche factor that you've got to take into account.
Yeah. If you measure the entire market, like say in that map, if you measured all of Southern California, then it would distort the numbers. The issue really is that you're kind of a local business and you're having to drive to your customers because it's a service business. So really you want to take a look at your real market, not this sort of artificial market that is, say, all of Los Angeles, because then that distorts your numbers. It makes you look like, you're just nothing. And you don't know if the characteristics of the Los Angeles, say, clientele is really the same as the Inland Empire. Of course, every industry is different. So, but yeah, it's an indication that you would want to look at it and seriously consider if your market needs to be altered, or if you need to look at, say, people who have another talent, being able to sell higher end ones, or does you need to change your marketing completely because you saturated your market. Most of the time, if you happen to be in the middle, as in your example, you're vulnerable to the low end and the high end. You're no man's land. So you want to refine your market so that you can kind of stay out of the way of all the big guys.
Now, the principle applies that we saw samples was your clients, right? Percentage of your clients, 20% of revenue comes from 20% of your clients or your employees. That's kind of what I was looking at. Could it be a good example
let me just correct you. It would be 20% of your clients are creating 80% of your revenue. Yeah.
And the other 80% of my and employees too, you mentioned, right?
Well, yeah, same.
So like the most effective top 20% are creating the 80% of the revenue when it comes out to that.
Yeah, or even the value in the company.
And the resume of that way of thinking, the principle is that it also could apply in other things other than revenue or employees.
Absolutely. Jordan Peterson explains it. He does an awful lot on this particular point, and he explains it to say any means of production. So anytime you're looking at a productive environment, you're making something, you're doing service for people, widgets, or people are coming to you. Anytime that happens, you end up having this situation where certain individuals or certain companies, if they're buyers, will be much more important. The 20% will be much more important than the 80%. It's a natural phenomena, and I think that it's kind of difficult to determine why that is. I've never heard anybody explain why it happens, but every mathematician would say it does happen.
So in the business I'm in, I might be identifying it without really looking for it, on finding what causes the biggest service calls. Because
Absolutely. So based on that one example, 20% of 20% of your calls, 20% of the issues will be creating 80% of your calls.
Okay, and so if I'm receiving if I focus on understanding that, is like, okay, instead of like being stuck working on just service calls, instead of that, I focus on the problem. An example would be an electricity outage. It doesn't happen often, but it does create 80% of my calls.
Wow.
Because even though they know that the electricity went out, the PO stops working, they still call me anyways.
Hey, of course.
Because what do we do? And so adding a backup battery and a backup internet was the solution to try to resolve 80% of my phone calls.
Yeah, exactly. Ed, you look like you've got a comment.
Well, I see this as a powerful way of looking at strategic planning. When you look at, for instance, on the staffing side, and you look at 10% or 20% of your employees producing 80% of the work, that's pretty profound. You look on the other side of it, 80% of your employees, what are they doing?
That's right. And I knew you were going to bring that up.
Yeah. So, every company thinks that they don't have enough staffing, and in reality, a lot of times, most of the time, they do have more than enough. They just don't. They're not measuring the waste, the unproductive
That's right.
items that are
Yeah,
going
and
on.
there are several ways to measure that, I imagine. But I would say, your measurement of ass time is people sitting around on their ass.
Yeah,
That's how you notice that, is because you see that there are people sitting around, not getting
that's
it
right.
done, not doing, doing the slow walk over to the trash,
Right.
spending a few more minutes at the coffee machine than everybody else, that whole thing. And so the question then is, well, how do you change that? Certainly, you're not going to fire 80% of the people,
Right.
because you still have to have 100% of the work done.
Right.
But then on the other hand, I believe that one other way to look at it is that you're literally in a factory. You're not going to have 20% of the people producing 80% of the units, but you're going to have 20% of the units representing 80% of the revenue.
Right.
Or you're going to have, if you look at the entire company, and you're looking at the owner, the CPA, or the controller, in two or three of the key managers, you get 20% of those people, and they're making the decisions that create 80% of the value in the company.
I'm looking at it from a revenue perspective. So if you go into a company and you find out, let's see here, 90% of your, or let's say 20% of your customers, well, we're looking at, from the revenue perspective, we're looking at 30% of your customer generating 80% of your, 20% of your customers generating 80% of your revenue, right?
Right.
So if you have, if it's more tilt to the upside, how do you do that? If you got so many big customers, how do you diversify? What are some of the things you can do to get more customers? Because a lot of businesses are relying upon a few customers for their whole business model, and they don't have any way of bringing the smaller people into play and building their revenue up over time.
Yeah.
So, if I could add a little bit into that one, in the electronics industry world, quite often you'll have low run, medium run companies who they have to have a lot of companies, a lot of product at low run items. And then they get the one or two high runners that these guys run and command the industry. And a couple of the companies that I work very closely with, they're at the 50%, 40% of their total revenue are coming in from two customers out of, say, 3,000 or 4,000 customers.
Yeah.
And,
wow. That's a big.
And at that point, as a consultant, you'd say, congratulations, you've got some really big revenue coming in. Now you got a warning because you're at high jeopardy at this point. And so the part of it is there's an emphasis from management that goes, hey, this is a good thing. I'm excited. He's brought in a $2 million contract, meaning that all the $10,000 and $20,000 contracts are not valuable. And so the sales force in this case got slanted. I said, hey, don't worry about the small stuff. Let's get the big stuff. But what they hadn't figured out is the big stuff only came after you had walked these companies through the small stuff. You had to be in there.
Yeah.
You had to have the relationship. And once in a while, there was a big winner that came out. But if you weren't in for the muck, which was actually not muck, it was good business, you wouldn't get the home run. Yes. And I think so. To answer your question, Ed, I think this is a management problem. Leadership gets in love with the big numbers, and they then almost dissuade doing business that's profitable, but it's not really that profitable.
Well, that gets into the next point. And then coming up with a gross profit margin by each customer really makes a difference, because you're probably going to find out the big customers are getting a hell of a deal, and maybe aren't generating the amount of revenue or the amount of profit you think they should.
Exactly. And of course we've gone through, those issues, and so many times, especially smaller companies, they don't even have the numbers to be able to calculate whether that's the case.
No.
So, when I say a big gorilla and you're probably making less money, that's because the assumption is that the big gorilla is negotiating a little harder. They're a little more professional. They have the expectation that with increased volume, your costs will drop and they would like part of those savings themselves. That's why they give you the big orders. And so it's sort of like, wait a minute, when you get to the point to where you're more efficient because you've got the 2 million run, that's because they want to give you the 2 million so they can get the lower price so they can be more competitive or they can make more money. So I mean, it's all part of the game. So how do you think about knocking the little guys off of the charts? During COVID, we know for sure that there were some little guys who didn't have access to production because machines were full. And so who gets cut? Well, the little guy's the one that gets cut. And so then on the other hand, how much does it take to go out and get another gorilla? And the answer, and part of that question is, are there other gorillas? Sometimes you've already got business with the top 3 people in a particular marketplace. And if you've got that, the only thing that is left are the ones who are number 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, on the market share list. And that's all you're going to get from those people. So the right mix is important. And of course, knowing this 80-20 anomaly and how it can vary up and down doesn't do you any good unless, Ed, you've got the numbers.
So one other factor that we haven't talked about in this that I think really does apply, one of my mantras is people first, profits follow.
Mhm.
And, it sounds a little bit simplistic, but if you get the right people on the bus, you're going to end up getting the right products and the right profit. And one of the problems with ruling out some of the smaller runners, the smaller companies, is if you're in this for more than 10 years, you will find very quickly that people migrate from one entity to another entity to another. And if they've been involved in this particular type of industry in one, they're going to be involved in it in the second. So you're going to find out that the guys that you treat well in the smaller companies end up migrating over a period of 10 years to larger companies, and they remember you and they bring you with them and you bring them with you. I think this relational part of this needs to be emphasized as well. You're not looking at the company and the size of revenue. You're actually looking at the relationships within those companies and realize that this is a very sticky, wet situation. If you treat the people right, they'll treat you right. And the good people will actually grow, and the good people will then introduce you to the better harvest. So to me, it's all about relational selling and also relational service. Especially in the financial area, because what happens in the financial area is people have good times and they have bad times. And you got your best customer, all of a sudden is short of cash. What are you going to do? And how do you deal with it?
Yeah.
And how do you maximize the value of you staying with them? Because that's what you've got to do.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And those kinds of decisions have to be made by management, which is why they add so much value to every company and why they get paid so much more, is because they're having to make hopefully the correct decisions. And the mix is very interesting, because you're right, you can't just look at the math. If you and you're absolutely right about individuals are the people you're actually doing business with, and they do switch companies, and those individuals bring more business, and we've all seen that happen over and over again. And so if you get a little too big for your britches, and you're sort of treating the little guys like, that's not a very big order. Gosh, I don't have time to call them back. Yeah, it's just, it's just not worth it. Well, that person just might move up the ladder and be buying 10 times what they used to buy. The next time they're going, now that I'm a little bit bigger and I'm buying more stuff, I'm certainly not going to use these old guys because they treated me like crap when I was little.
Well, at the end of the day, you do make that relationship choice a little bit on chemistry. I mean, the numbers have to map out, but what tilts the deal is the chemistry, which comes down to integrity, the ability to be authentic, and to be committed to your journeying with them.
Mhm.
That journeying with situation means that there's an intimacy in the dialogue. And everybody knows that you make money and they make money. So the question then just comes in, how do we justify and do it correctly?
Yes.
Absolutely. And we talked about this also. We've been involved with customers, Ron, where profit margins for the total amount of business may have way different impacts on the based upon the profit margin of the products that they buy.
Yeah.
So really like those gross profit margins by customer, by product is really important for determining if you're making any money or not.
You bet. And I might add that each of you have brought up circumstances where having adequate cash means a lot for creating opportunities. So in the case, John, where you mentioned, what do you do when your best customer is just a little short on cash? Well, you want to be honest. You want them to be honest with you. I mean, is this temporary, and are they going to be able to pay you? And is it a 30-day, deal, or 90 days, or 120? How much cash would we have to, quote, loan you in order to keep our relation good? And will you remember, if we do this, will you remember us down the road when you've got more business? We want to have our piece of that. Well, if you don't have the cash, it's a non-issue. It's like you can't do it. You got to go borrow the money yourself, etc. But if you do have the cash, you've got the wherewithal to be able to pull that off. Now you've just created a service that your customer will remember when times were really tough. And so that's, and I think that's true for looking for opportunities in terms of, say, buying another machine or another truck. We have been in an era where we've tried to maximize our cash. And on the other hand, sometimes having the cash is the investment itself. For instance, in inventory, if you magically knew that you needed to have a lot more inventory of masks than you normally did, and you were able to triple your inventory sort of based on the commodity price, you would have doubled or tripled your margins too. And but having the cash is something that gives you an opportunity, or the credit. But when you have to add expenses of high interest rates, now that changes the whole dynamics. Look what happened to the bank up in Silicon Valley, where all that happened was a shift in interest rates, and it put the bank out of business. That doesn't happen with most companies because interest is a smaller part of their cost structure, but it's certainly part of it. So Ed and I work with a particular client that has had a problem with storage space. And then at other times, they don't have a problem with storage space. They have a problem that a customer doesn't have any storage space. Well, how do we utilize a good cash position to be able to change the inventory scenario so that we can actually help the customer and keep them, or in this case, too, get some more revenue because you're now selling storage. So you can do it both ways. Having cash, I think having cash in this environment is more important than it's been in the past.
I totally agree. After the pandemic, most companies are really struggling with working capital. Their working capital has gone up significantly.
Mm-hmm.
And because it takes a long time normally to do what has to be done so that you can build the revenue, and then you got to spend time collecting the revenue. which adds a lot of cost to the process that people don't see on a P&L a lot of times. So they think it's free money, but it really isn't. And getting people to pay on time, good customers, is really important. But by the same token, being able to stretch your neck out a little bit to support one of your big customers in a time of need, as long as it's controlled, it makes a lot of sense because it adds a lot of value to the long-term relationship.
Yeah, right. Well, so as we end this up, I want to bring up another kind of topic that has to do with the Parado Principle as well. And that is, in this, Jordan Peterson, who most of you know, I believe, is a psychologist, and he looks at everything through the science of psychology lens. He talks about the factors that make the personality factors that make entrepreneurs successful. And one of the scale on the big five personality factors has to do with creativity. And they call it open to change. If you're open to change, it means you like looking at new ideas and new situations and inventions and that sort of thing. It's very, very creative sort of approach. If you're on the other end of the same scale, you tend to be more of a traditionalist. You don't want to really move very fast. You want to make sure of what you're doing, and you don't want to change very much because you just prefer to know everything's going to be the same. And so what he does is he says for entrepreneurs are generally, and so speaking here to our smaller micro giant group, entrepreneurs tend to be more open to change, and therefore they're looking for an opportunity, and they'll just switch on just turn on a dime and go out and do something. And Edgar's raising his hand there. We're trying to keep Edgar, to push a little closer to the traditional side, the conservative side of that. But I mean, and so here's what Jordan Peterson says. He says that almost none of you folks out there are creative. And we tend to say, oh, everybody's creative. No. As a matter of fact, he says the number of people out of a group of 200 or 300 is very close to zero. Now, of course, it's not, but there's only a few. Out of a few hundred, there are only a few creative people. The people who really are all the way on that scale of the openness to change. But those are the ones who become the entrepreneurs. And so when you look at the success of being an inventor or an entrepreneur, Jordan Peterson basically uses harsher language. He says, you really ought to think very carefully about this, because if you think you're going to be a painter or a musician, of course, you know about this part, Ed, any of these highly creative things where it's you doing the creativity, the chances of you making a living doing it are a little bit and almost none.
That's right, slim to none.
It's really tough, really tough.
Absolutely.
And therefore, the things we're doing here at Microgiants is to try to help those who are open to change realize that certain things do need to stay the same. You need to have the numbers. You need to look at the margins. You need to understand some of these principles as a supplement to making sure you're going to continue to make some money, because it's easy to create things. It's a lot harder to create things at a profit. And so that's his example. And I mentioned the 1% of downloads in music, and Jordan Peterson says it even better. He says 0.1% of all the music that's listened to or played real time, like in a symphony, is it's like 80 or 90% of the songs that you go hear have been written by 0.1% of the writers.
That's amazing.
Who are those people? Oh, names like Bach and Beethoven. The really, really, really great experts, the ones who stood out in their fields, the ones who were child prodigies like Mozart. Those are the ones who are still producing most of the listening audience. It's crazy. And of course, you throw in, the Beatles, and this doesn't have to be classical at all, but it's really rare, really rare. And therefore, when you're thinking about starting a new business and what's it going to be and where's your niche going to be, you have to think in terms of, we want to be creative and we want to be innovative. And, we did two or three shows on innovation. You want to do that, and you can do that, but you don't want to go off the end of the diving board, until you know how sort of deep the water is. And so that's the other sort of the usage of the 80-20 rule is that it sort of overlaps with the personalities of the people who are trying to build businesses. So any other comments about that before we wrap up?
I want to add maybe one more observation comment is a question mostly. I think it would be more of a question. So you guys were talking about the 20% of the employees are bringing 80% of the revenue. And then Eddie mentioned that, well, what is the other 80% doing, right?
Yeah.
Would it be good to say that it's more of a cycle where you have a situation where things have settled, change hasn't happened in a while. You got an 80% gap of people just not being able to be productive. And that's when the creative entrepreneurs come in, figured a way how to eliminate a big bunch of that unused labor, throws the whole system in chaos.
Yeah.
A couple of years later, recycles again. And then eventually that's what creates innovation. That's what pushes innovation. The fact that you have this principle and it's a cycle that keeps happening over and over again. And eventually we keep inventing new things. We keep, bettering things because it keeps happening essentially over and over again. But we need time and no change for a while to figure it out. What is it that needs to be innovated again?
Let me take a stab at what you just said. If you have 100 employees, what we're saying, you better not make a mistake on the top 20.
That's right.
80% of the work. Now, the remaining 80%, you could lose 10% a year and probably would be very helpful for the company if you did. And replace them with more high potential employees. So maybe over a year, maybe you could get rid of 20% of your staff and maybe bring in 2 or 3 more top hitters that could really make a difference.
I'm going to have another contrarian point of view on this for a second. And I do get the 20% performing 80% of the work, and I know that. And there have been times when I think each of us in our own relative positions have been that in the 20%, if not part of it. I can't help but wondering, though, if there are individuals in that 80% who are actually putting down the carpet, making the floor so that you can stand on it to do your 80%. In other words, the guy who picks up the trash, the guy who keeps the building clean, the guy who makes sure the internet's going in the background, which doesn't get attributed to any of the real glory and input. But without those people doing the base level work, and I say base level as in foundational, you're not going to get it. And my mind went to a surgery center where you've got an ophthalmologic surgeon or somebody who's involved in extremely fine work, cranial retinal work, that guy is obviously very gifted and he is going to get the glory for the saving the life. But the reality is the guys who put the air conditioning systems in that keep it going and keep the power on so it doesn't fail in the middle of it, keeps all your equipment. I'm just wondering whether or not it's a little bit of a lopsided curve, because yes, they do produce it, but they wouldn't without that 80%.
I think that's an interesting point, John. It's like the red pen, blue pen parable, where you can produce blue pens really profitably and red pens not very profitably, but you're not accounting for the fact that selling packets of red pens and blue pens is what's causing blue pens to be profitable. It's a question of where you allocate the credit.
Yeah. I think you do have to look at it with a couple of different lenses, really. Many times the lack of production, this doesn't necessarily point to lazy people. sometimes it points to management that doesn't realize that they're not using their people appropriately.
Oh, that's very true, Ron.
See, so I mean, I remember when I used to be a peace squirter, and I was in a John's heard this story, but I was working for a canning company, and they happened to be cooking and canning peas, and they had these giant bins of peas, and my job was when they brought the bin back, there were a few residual peas in there, and my job was to squirt it out with a hose. Well, I mean, this was an absurd job to do. And of course, I was getting, like $1 an hour or something like that. But, I mean, so it wasn't a big cost factor, but the productivity that I did in that factory was just almost nothing, even compared to the people on the line who were just checking cans to make sure that they hadn't exploded. In another example, same factory, there were two guys who were pushing these big, heavy bins, across from one building to the other building, and occasionally they got behind all the time because they were working slow, and so they would push everything off the track onto the side track like a train track, and they did that. As workers, they did that slowly, and so in that particular case, it was kind of like, why did you give them this sidetrack so that they could work slow? Okay, that's management's problem. And then why do you put up with them being so slow? So I mean, it kind of goes both ways. But in the overview, you take a look at the important work. It had to do with the huge number of cans that got filled and cooked and got packed, as opposed to a whole bunch of other people that did auxiliary things, had to be done, but they weren't very important or valuable to the whole process. So the people in the factory have to figure out how to take these expensive, not value creating processes and eliminate them. So see, it's not necessarily the workers themselves, but it's an interesting process, because when you do this analysis, you really have to be open to a wide variety of fixes and solutions in order to increase productivity, because your productivity may not go up, but your competition's probably will.
I
Absolutely.
got one more to add to this. I'm thinking basketball, IU basketball. Spent some time in the Midwest, and back in the day, Bobby Knight was extremely known for spinning the wheel at the last 30 seconds and pulling 7-10 points out of it. And they do the analysis, and there'd be one or two players that they did 80% of the points.
Yes.
But he actually he forced the team to be a team. And you may have somebody who's incredible at 3-pointers, but without the support and everybody else lining him up, getting it clear, he's just not going to do it.
Yeah, you've got to have a great rebounder, and you got to be able to pass the ball to the guy who can shoot.
That's my but it comes back to Ed's point. It's not about laziness, it's about team involvement, and it's about everybody staying in their lane and supporting the hot shots.
Right.
Right now, San Diego State's in the Final Four. They do not have a prolific shooter. It's a total team effort. When the ball's on the floor, you got 5 San Diego State guys going for the ball.
Yeah.
Whereas you don't see the other teams willing to do that. They're really doing the real blue collar work, getting in there and getting things done. So yeah, teamwork. God, we could talk about teamwork all day long. It's very, very powerful. And without it, you're going to lose a lot of productivity.
You bet.
Well, and to that point where, in the classic world, Ron would be in his marketing role and have an iron fist in that. And then somebody else might be in sales and really run those numbers. And somebody else will be in finance and support. Unless those guys can really get in together and support each other, and even to bring each other into their respective disciplines to add value and weight, it's not going to happen.
You're quite right, and not to get off track, but mathematically, it's been very, very well proven that coordinated marketing efforts work better than individual ones. So that's.
I have a situation with one client where the CFO is always saying, "That's not my job."
Oh, yeah.
I keep telling him, it is your job. Your sphere of influence. You should be making everybody else better.
Yeah.
And that's not how they look at it. They don't, I don't want to be involved in that. Well, I think in that situation, maybe we have some of the wrong people in jobs that really aren't making other people better. And I think that's the essence behind the basketball analogy. If you're really good at what you do, you're going to make everybody else better by being a better teammate.
But just ask your CEO, if one of the junior people right down the line causes a multi-million lawsuit in his company, is that his job or not his job? Because at the end of the day, see, my take on this, maybe it's because I'm from New Zealand, but at the end of the day, the guy who sits supposedly at the top of the pyramid is actually responsible for everything going on.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
You know, so.
Well, I'd like to say then in wrapping up here today that part of my goal was not to be the 20% that said 80% of the words. And so I think we've had a good discussion. And so I think we got more like a 60-40 here in terms of participation. So
I think it's a good point, though,
guys.
Ron, is this is a tool that's out there in the toolbox that could be used in analyzing a company as part of the strategic planning process, evaluating results. You know, the 80-20 rule really has some merit. And it's based on logic and mathematics.
Yes, it absolutely does. And so we always want to remember that as we go forward in our business. Thank you very much, guys.